Whether or not HTML is a programming language, it certainly has white space in it, and the ways that it's used are weird, and the ways that it behaves are even weirder. Think about it. When you have some HTML, like let's say you have a div, and you have content in it, you probably tab it to the side so it's shown to be inside the div. Where did that white space go, though? How does HTML work in such a way where you can format it like that and also have things formatted properly on your pages? And when do the spaces you put into your text actually appear, and when do they not? These are all great questions. And it turns out there's a lot to know about here because this is probably the longest article I've ever considered covering for a video. Because HTML whitespace is fundamentally very, very broken. I am super excited to dive into this with y'all. But first, a quick word from today's sponsor. Are you tired of waiting around for your builds? Today's sponsor, Blacksmith, is certainly going to help you out there. There's never been a better way to build your code on GitHub. Yes, even better than GitHub Workers. And I mean it. It's literally one line of code to change over from a traditional GitHub worker over to using Blacksmith. And the results are insane. You get way more cache, 25 gigs instead of 10 gigs of cache. You get 4x the network speeds accessing that cache and getting other things online, 40 megabit per second instead of 100. Your actual code runs faster, up to 2 times faster than GitHub runners. It's way cheaper. It's hilarious. And it's not like this is some weird side project. There are a lot of real companies and real projects building on Blacksmith today. An app like PostHog, another wonderful channel sponsor here, has cut their build times down from 8 minutes and 38 seconds down to 1 minute 27 seconds just by moving over to Blacksmith. And it is almost 1/10 the price for them. How crazy is this? It's not just for us JS devs either. You see projects that are all real native here handling it great too. Man, their Docker builds are nuts. The way they handled storage makes them up to 40 times faster. And this obsession with performance exists at every layer in their whole system. They've built their own caching layers for Go, Node, Python, Ruby, even Zig. Chances are, if you're deploying real code, Blacksmith will make it deploy, build, test, and everything else way faster. Thanks again to Blacksmith for sponsoring. Check them out today at soydev.link/blacksmith. I've had a little bit of pain with HTML whitespace, but I am curious how deep this goes. Huge shout out to Doug Parker for writing this one. I am hyped. Apparently they're on the Angular team, which means they probably know whitespace better than anyone. Let's dive in. Recently, I was working on a project which required a deeper understanding of how whitespace works in HTML. I was never a fan of HTML whitespace behavior before, as I've been burned by it a few times. But as I dug into it more deeply, I found myself discovering complex design issues that I wanted to explore in a blog post. This is partially to write down my knowledge in the space for future reference, and partially to vent about how unnecessarily complicated it all is. I can't tell you how many of my own blog posts and even some of my videos were me writing down something that was hard so I could find it later on. I love that reason for writing things. Good stuff. Let's break it down. How whitespace actually works, why it works that way, the problems that the HTML tools have, how it should work, and of course, what we can do about it. MD has an article that he cited here, but let's break it down, starting with inline elements. So if we have here, first, second, no space here, there is no space rendering it. We do first, space, second, we get a space between the two. This makes obvious sense. The difference between 1 and 2 is clear in the code. Obviously, the developer intentionally put a space in 2, and it follows that 1 would not have space between the links. Beyond single spaces, HTML is subject to whitespace collapsing, where multiple spaces are collapsed into a single space. That means adding additional spaces has no effect. It's exactly the same as having 1. Oh boy, we're gonna go downhill really fast. I can already tell. New lines and tabs are also treated identically and collapsed into spaces. So here we have a new line, and it becomes a space. Weird. New line implying spacing feels very strange to me. The space between the tags is rendered as an independent text node, meaning it doesn't inherit the styles from either of the A tags. It does not include an underscore, and clicking the white space doesn't trigger either link. Given the space in HTML is not within either A tag, seems pretty reasonable. Yeah, like how would you target that space? If you wanted to add like if we had both of these links had a class that applied a font size, how do we apply the font size to the space that gets auto-inserted between? Do you have to do that in a parent element? But let's keep experimenting. If we put this inside a span, then any leading and trailing white space is not preserved. So we have all the space here indented, and that doesn't get preserved. And there's many spaces before A, they do not render to the user, because the white space at the start of a rendering block is removed completely. Typically, spaces which are visible to the user are referred to as significant, while spaces which are not rendered are considered insignificant. For the above example, the new line and indentation between the links are significant because they will be collapsed to a single space as well as being rendered. The indentation before the first link and the trailing new line after the second link are insignificant and not displayed to the user. Kind of weird that the new line is considered significant and gets displayed as one space, and none of the other spacing here is. Very strange. This also applies to white space inside of a tag. Consider these examples. So we have hello world with no space, and then hello world with a space in front. Still, the number of spaces in the rendered output is the same. This time I put one space at the end because it collapses it to one space. That's really weird. It's collapsing this space and all of this space into one space. Why? In 7, we see the space between world and exclamation point is preserved, and the space is underscored with the rest of the link. If you click the space precisely enough, you'll actually follow the link. That makes sense. It's really funny because you can't hit it there. It has to be within the click. That's weird. 7 actually shows even more collapsing because there's spaces between hello and world. As I mentioned before, there's a space here as well as a space here, but it's being collapsed into one for some reason. How does the browser actually decide, though? Fantastic question. What happens if we swap the order? So we put the space here and not there. It looks like the space goes to whichever one came first. So now that space is being included in the link, where here it wasn't because the space first occurred outside of the tag. Weird. I might have been able to guess some of these behaviors, but this is strange. The white space is underscored because it was in the preceding node. This also highlights the most common footgun I've seen with HTML whitespace, links with extra spaces. Consider this example. Hello, space, link, puts this on a new line. Here is some long link text that is going onto its own line. Empty space here. Please take a look at it. Because the new line infers a white space, as we discussed earlier, that white space collapses this one. So even though you put the space here, since it implied a space due to the new line, this space gets collapsed into the one for the link. I have ran into this so many times and it just clicked in my head why. Oh boy. Oh man, this is going to get bad fast, I can tell. Yeah. Since the link is on its own line, the text ends with a new line character before the closing A tag. That means the rendered output places the space within the link itself, so the underscore trails one character further than you might have expected. Yep, and as I said, since the space after gets collapsed into the link space, it's bad. Here's another fun one. Hello, here is some long link text that goes on its own line. Please take a look at it. This works because the A tag is on its own line, but if you were to reformat it, it would break. That's great. Your formatter might not like this, but we'll get to it later. I already see people in chat calling out Prettier and how it does weird formatting and includes strings with empty spaces in weird ways. Almost all of that is to work around these things because we're all fighting the HTML spec as we do it. We probably should have thought about text and HTML slightly differently way back, but it's too late now. We're stuck with this. And it's also too late for you to bail. You're already however many minutes into the video. You're going to stick through. Let's be real. You have nothing else that you could be doing. Why else would you be watching a multi-hour-long video about whitespace? You know yourself. Block elements. All of the above examples apply to inline HTML elements. Block elements are similar, but they preserve a little less whitespace. As mentioned earlier about inline elements, any spaces at the start or end of a line are dropped. Block elements work similarly. Any whitespace in a block formatting context becomes its own block, except that whitespace-only blocks are then dropped entirely. That means any space around blocks is effectively ignored. So we have these two block elements, which are divs instead of spans, and we add white space, it doesn't get honored or used for anything. If you make them new lines, also doesn't do anything. The fact that all three of these render the same output is kind of weird. Recall that for inline elements, a space between them is significant and it gets included in the former element. But for block elements, there is no difference between these examples because all the white space differences are ignored and new lines are placed between the blocks. Even in example 12 with no white space at all, since it infers the new line between blocks, the new line gets created here. Interesting. Now that you understand how blocks and inline elements work, let's do a quick pop quiz. How do you expect the following to render? Aside is a block element, so it should follow the same rules as div. I don't know what aside does well enough to know for sure. Let's see what the actual answer is. You might intuitively think, well, aside is a block element, so it should follow the same rules. That is what I thought. And it's a very well-reasoned thought, apparently. And you're correct, most of the time. It's actually a trick question, though, because aside is a native block element, but it doesn't have to be. You can actually render different spacing based on how you style it. So we can have aside be display block, and it will work the same way. Or we can have it inline, and it will work the way that spans do. Fun. You can't actually trust the element type, because you could do display block or inline and break it. Yeah, the same HTML can lead to different whitespace behaviors. That might not sound too bad. After all, this is exactly the layout difference between block and inline. However, it actually changes the fundamental text content being displayed to the user. It is kind of crazy that a style change like that can actually change the text itself the user is seeing. Hadn't thought about it like that before. I like how he's referring to this here. There is a real semantic difference between these two things, even if we're only applying that in styles. Obviously, you can change things like text content via styles, but you wouldn't expect a display change to affect how text is rendered and read. Function in JS, text content in inner text. Interesting. If you call the element and read text content, it will read different than if you call inner text, which will add the new line for block elements. Very interesting that these resolve differently depending on the CSS. So if you have different styles on your HTML, JS will read the text differently. That is weird. I did not think about this that way before. It's kind of strange that a CSS flag will change how inner text gets returned to you. Why? This is going to get so bad. I am scared. Oh God. That's like HTML, CSS, and JS having this level of relations is something that always freaks me out. But God. Ugh. And people are mad at us for putting HTML and JS with JSX, and they're not complaining about this, though. Per MDN, inner text is aware of styling, so it can tell the difference between these two examples in a way that text content cannot. You can even hear the difference with text-to-speech tools. Windows Narrator on Chrome treats block elements as different text fields, while inline elements are joined together into a single word. Here I put the word refrigerator split across multiple aside tags. The first attempt uses the default display block, while the second uses inline. This is probably just using narrator. Yeah, I don't want to speech to text. You get the idea. Narrator on the first attempt tries to read it as 4 different words. It converts fry to fried. Okay, never mind. We have to listen to this. I changed my mind.
Block versus inline refrigerator. Refrigerator.
Ow. That's, yeah. Also, narrator trying to convert fry to Friday. Oh, I've done my time trying to get speech to text stuff to work properly back at Twitch. It's so important, and it is so hard. There is, I believe, still a bug to this day on Twitch where whenever a new chat message comes in, every message in chat gets reread because I think this is specific to the Windows narrator tool, actually, thinks the new element means the whole content of that div changed, and it rereads the whole thing. Whew. Yeah. These are the takeaways from the chaos we just saw here. First, whitespace handling of HTML content can be controlled purely through CSS. This is also interesting because it means the whitespace handling isn't done by the HTML parser. The parser must retain all spaces because it's actually the CSS layer which decides whether or not those spaces are significant. I would not have realized this before, and I really like how the author led us here to realize this point. This is a really good article, and we're just getting started. Second, the actual content of a web page can be manipulated by CSS. The page should contain either refrigerator or refrigerator, regardless of the CSS applied. The presentation layer of CSS should not get to decide which of these two interpretations is correct. That's the HTML's job. This also implies that search engines may index different textual content based on whether they process a page's CSS styling, which really bulldozes any idea of separation of concerns between HTML and CSS. I have a relevant example. Give me one moment. This is a message I got from some friends at Vercel recently. The SEO for upload thing has been a bitch for a while for a bunch of reasons that are very stupid and mostly not in our control. But it looks like the HTML parsing that exists within Google didn't handle the new lines properly. So we ended up with this weird upload thing, upload beta, better file uploads for, because it's the CSS all looks fine. If we go to uploadthing.com, which by the way you should, we're the best way to do file uploads, we have the new line here for developers. And this reads and looks fine. But apparently, if you don't read the CSS, Google is not smart enough and will do this wrong. I can't believe this article already solved a bug that I literally got messaged about yesterday, 1 day ago. Why is this a useful article? This was supposed to be a fun read, not useful and painful. I'm happy you guys get this. Yeah, this is pain. This is pain. We lost meta tags in a recent change. It's my fault that that happened, but still it is funny. I am in pain. Speaking of pain, let's look at pre-formatted text. But wait, I hear you say, if you don't like HTML spacing, just use the pre-tag. Yeah, that's a valid point. HTML does have a pre-tag for pre-formatted text, which automatically preserves all white space. So here we have hello world, new line, I am pre-formatted, a bunch of space, text, which is interesting. Tabbed in, this new line is indented more than the rest. Awesome. This is going to go downhill fast, isn't it? No white space collapsing occurred, and all of the content is considered significant, except when it isn't. Thanks, HTML. There are actually 2 insignificant spaces here. The first new line that immediately followed the initial pre, yeah, there's a new line here, and that wasn't honored. But the last new line also wasn't. So there's a new line at the end here, and that didn't become a new line or space as well. Very fun. Neither of these new lines are rendered. There is no blank line at the start or end of the rendered result. Surprisingly, if we check text content, we don't see the first new line, but we do see the second one, even though it's not What? Why? Why is this here? It's not even being... What? So if we check this with the inner text thing, right? That's what it is. Yeah, inner text. What happens? Okay, this one rendered with the new line, though. Is that because it's tabbed? Or did that just get included? Save without. Why? It's not here. It's not rendered. Why does inner text have different results? And if I kill the indenting here, why? The fuck? Okay, so text content and inner text are the same in this case, even though before they weren't. This detail hints at even more nuanced behavior, as whitespace at the start of a pre-tag is treated differently from the whitespace at the end, even though neither are shown to the user. So here we have the whitespace at the start. We have an extra whitespace here, and we have an extra one at the end. The start one gets collapsed, and the end one doesn't? Why? These two get dropped, and these two get collapsed into one. Why? If you put something in front, like an underscore, then it will honor it. Oh, if you put a space between them and the nearest new line. Okay, so the underscore makes the space visible, but if I just put a space here, and I put one here. I still have the page open? Yeah, I do. Yeah, that added those spaces. And the text content is now the /n space, which is meaningful because it means it'll actually render the new line where previously it wouldn't. Why? I hate all of this. There's an IQ meme here. We're on the dumb side. It's like HTML isn't a programming language because you don't write programs in it. The middle is, oh, no, HTML is a programming language. And the right's HTML is not a programming language because it's fucking shit. What is this? I'm remembering that HTML was made to format things for printers, and it really, really shows. God. And the new lines must be the first or last characters of the text. I can kind of see where the spec authors were going here. Usually, if you're putting a pre-tag on the page, you're probably going to put a new line before the content, like so. Like that. You're probably not going to do this, even though it would be more accurate when it comes to whitespace handling. The main takeaway is that even pre isn't as straightforward as you might have expected, despite being kind of the whole point of the tag. Not only that, but up until now, spaces and new lines have used the same collapsing behavior. This shows us that new lines and spaces can sometimes be treated distinctly from each other, and the ones at the start and the end can be treated differently too. What's the name of the untab thing? Dedent, yeah. My empathy for the Dedent creators keeps going up. If you're not familiar with Dedent, it's a library for JS and TS that lets you have a string that has different indentations in it because you want to have multiple lines for the string but still keep it readable, and it will handle those indentations and fix it for you. And also, if you want to make a new line like this to put the string in that way, it just handles all of these weird cases, which is really, really convenient. It now feels essential because HTML doesn't do any of this properly. God. Back to pre. Pre is also just generally unergonomic. While the white spacing behavior is definitely more intuitive, you can't indent at all without affecting its content. Compare these two examples. So we have this indented, and it does the indent, and you have this indented, and now it's indented more. This is why I've never used a pre anything but inline, because this shit is so bad. Like if I wanted to do this right, and delete that space, you have to have this be all the way back. Now imagine we're 15 elements deep, and now all of a sudden this resets the tab indentation all the way to the side. Ugh, gross. This example is diabolical. The fact that being deeper tabbed in means different rendered output is hilarious, because the whole point of HTML is you can nest things this way, and pre just breaks it. I still can't get over the fact that the new line on top doesn't render and the new line on bottom does. The fact that that and this are different, that if I move this pre-tag here, that's different than if it's on a new line, but the pre-tag on top, it doesn't matter for. What? Why? This is a descent into madness. Yeah, these both feel like they should contain the same text, and that's clearly a developer's intent. However, 21 is preceded by 4 spaces and 22 is preceded by 8, and it's trailed with a new line and another 4 spaces. That's especially tricky because the indentation causes spaces to come after the trailing new line. So the pre-collapsing of a final new line doesn't apply because it's not the last character. So you end up with an extra blank space. Yeah, even better. You get the new line in this one because you have that blank space here, and you don't in this one. This is actually going to kill me. This is putting it lightly. I just wouldn't use pre. I'm never going to use pre again after this. Straight up. Holy shit. Someone in chat was asking if dedent could be this simple. Gamer Girl is very smart, and things probably could be that simple. But I know now reading this, it can't be. And if we look at the actual source code for dedent, it can't be. They're handling a lot of edge cases here. Thankfully, there is a whitespace property in CSS. I'm so excited for you to ruin this for me too. The whitespace CSS property adds even more... No, it shouldn't. It's supposed to make things easier. Why does it add more complexity? This is going to hurt. This is going to hurt me a lot, isn't it? I'm scared. It supports whitespace pre, which can basically opt any element into the pre-tags parsing rules. It also supports pre-line, pre-wrap, and a few other possible options to further configure the behavior for specific use cases. Oh God. I have a feeling all of these options are going to have weird edge cases. As I mentioned earlier, whitespace processing is defined by CSS rules, not the HTML parser. So the standard which specifies this behavior is actually maintained by the CSS working group and primarily focuses on behaviors of the whitespace property. Between block elements, inline elements, and pre-tags, I think I've done a decent job justifying why HTML whitespace is confusing. However, if you still don't believe me, I'll also mention that Flexbox forces block rendering on its children, and inline block elements are also sensitive to minor whitespace changes. Because of course they are. I am so tempted to go down that rabbit hole, but if the author didn't on this giant article, I will trust his word and not do it. NBSP. So if this is all complicated and pre isn't the right solution, what other options are there? We've all been there. 2 elements are right next to each other, and you need a little space between them. That's not what I do. If I have these 2 things, and I have them in, let's say I have a nav element, and I want these to have a space between them, and I have them on the same line for some reason, I have a really simple solution. Look at that. My IDE is smart enough. Flex, gap 4. I don't trust HTML rendering at all. I personally just use CSS gap and flex containers because I don't trust it to this level. I've also done what chat is suggesting far too many times. Margin right 4px. Yep. Ow. If you've never understood what this NBSP thing is before, it's quite simple. It's an HTML entity representing a no-break space. Specifically, it's a space which the browser will never line wrap on. Hello NBSP world will never be split up into hello and world on different lines, no matter how narrow the viewport gets. This is a useful but frequently misused tool. If you need a space between 2 elements, especially elements in an inline text content where devs frequently reach for this NBSP, you probably don't want the non-breaking behavior. That is a very fair point. If you would use that here and this might render vertically in some places, it breaks. I knew it stood for non-breaking space, but I didn't think about the implications until now. Why does this feel like a must-read article for everybody who does web dev? This shouldn't be. We shouldn't have to know these things. If the entity appears outside of text content, such as between two blocks, then the non-breaking behavior doesn't even apply and it has no effect. So never mind. If you did put that here, it would be fine because these A tags are different blocks. Why? Instead, I suspect what devs really want from NBSP is its non-collapsible behavior. Multiple NBSP characters are not merged together and they can start or end lines. So here you can put a bunch of them and you'll have multiple spaces, which is actually apparently quite hard to do in HTML. Who would have thought? It's not considered white space like new lines, tabs, or general spaces are, so collapsing rules treat it like any other text. This sounds nice, but it comes with additional baggage. Beyond the non-breaking behavior, NBSP always takes up exactly one space worth of width, and this is never reduced. Except there is one extremely common scenario where spaces are eliminated, and that's line wrapping. Since it is non-breaking spaces, you'd think it would never line wrap, except as I mentioned above, the non-breaking behavior has no effect when it's used outside of text content. So if you use it to space out two blocks, you've created a line wrap problem. Check out this example. So we have NBSPs between these. We have the class, we have that first class block, we have the span, and we have another class block. What? All of those states made no sense. The fact that the big issue here, to be clear for people who don't understand, the space carrying over and being applied in front of this element never makes sense. Imagine if when text wrapped, it could move a space at the end of a line, the end of a sentence, the end of a word, so that this gets spaced one character forward. Ugh. Oh, God. Yeah, the ideal behavior would be to show the space between the two squares when they're adjacent, but NBSP is not able to support that, and it always takes up space. Even the boxes are already separated due to line wrapping. I suspect most usage of NBSP actually have line wrapping bugs, which developers don't notice because they don't go out of their way to test this particular behavior. So what I'm hearing is the right way to write a blog post and to make sure your text is spaced correctly is to take your post and make it an array, hello, and then render this, flex gap 4 for the one rem, and flex wrap. There we go. Here's the only safe way I found thus far to make sure wraps work properly. Are you fucking kidding? I'm in pain. Yeah. Unfortunately, there is no great alternative to NBSP, which would handle line wraps correctly. The number 32 character sounds like the right entity, but it gets collapsed like regular space, so it doesn't help here either. So there is no non-collapsing space that still breaks properly. What? I did this ironically, but it actually feels like the right way to do shit. Holy fuck this. So what's the correct solution for spacing out two elements? Well, it's probably best to do it in the CSS with margin. No, don't tell me my meme was right. I did that as a joke. No. I hate this. When people say that web dev isn't serious because it's not hard, they're delusional. Web dev isn't serious because it's too hard. Anyways, so apparently the correct solution is using margin or padding. Ow. But if you really need to, you can do a pre-tag or the whitespace property, which is probably best way to have maximum control over spacing behavior. However, I honestly can't blame you if you still end up reaching for NBSP. I don't have a great alternative beyond do it in CSS, which just isn't a drop-in solution. Oh boy. That's the problems, but how did we actually end up here? That's a great question because I can't imagine this being anything other than like a psychopath's desires to show us how bad things could be. Why do we make this language so complicated? I think the problem here is that all whitespace in HTML is ambiguous. Specifically, it's ambiguous with regard to the developer's intent. For any given space, did the developer mean for it to be displayed to the user, or did they just want to keep the code under the line length limits? It's impossible for the browser to know. To address this, the designers of HTML tried to come up with a set of rules which would roughly map the HTML code they wanted to write to the rendered output they wanted to create. So you, as a dev, have a UI in your head, and you just write out the HTML to display it, and usually the whitespace just works. I'm honestly kind of amazed at how consistently correct it is as is. Fair. To be fair, I hadn't thought about this deeply before this article. I just had a few weird bugs here and there. The fact that it usually does what we would usually expect is impressive. But holy fuck, are there skeletons in this closet? But even that isn't 100% correct. Sometimes the developer doesn't expect whitespace to behave the way it does, and it leads to complicated, hard to understand bugs. Pre-tags simplify things that are intended to be use cases where whitespace is significant and needs to be retained, but it makes authoring those strings in HTML really awkward and overly precise. Developers are forced to choose between the default syntax that usually works and is convenient to write, or a pre-syntax, which can be very precise in its expression of spacing that they want, but it's also incredibly awkward and inconvenient to work with. Contrast this with basically any other programming language where user-visible strings are syntactically distinct from the general whitespace. Like, in this case, JavaScript. This looks suspiciously similar to something I just did. Yeah. In this example, all of the spaces and new lines are explicit. Everything within quotes is intended for the end user, and everything outside of the quotes is intended for the developer. Fun fact, I've worked in a bunch of code bases, both at Twitch and outside, that had a lint rule on that you couldn't use bare strings in your JSX. The lint rules would error when you did this and force you to wrap it. I suddenly sympathize with their reasoning for it. I'm probably going to start turning that rule on in my code bases because I hate all of these behaviors and they have caused us enough pain at this point. Oh boy. Also, a reason this is useful is in the future, if you want to internationalize, you can have an international function that you wrap all of these strings with that will use them as a key to get the translated version, which is really, really handy. So having it in a string by default makes certain things in the future much easier too. So yeah. In this example, all the spaces and new lines are explicit. Everything within the quotes is intended for the end user, and everything outside is intended for the developer. The format has its own problems. Multi-line text can get very awkward, for example, but at least it's unambiguous whether any given space is significant to the end user or insignificant and intended only for the dev. Just imagine working in a language where text didn't need to be quoted. All I can remember is what? Like the WAT talk where they added bare strings support to Ruby. Ugh. Yeah, this, obviously this is bad. Nobody would say otherwise. Don't do this. And it sounds awful, and I have no idea how that would work. Except you don't need to imagine such a situation because you already write HTML which works exactly like this. And despite writing a whole blog post on the matter, I have no idea how it works either. Also, if you believe HTML syntax is justified because it's intended to represent documents and occasionally authored by non-devs, I just want to say, no, it isn't. Is this a whole separate... Oh, this is at the bottom. Isn't HTML just a document? No. Excited for that part. We'll get there, though. Don't want to skip too far ahead. HTML tooling. Let's zoom out from the browser to talk about the developer writing the HTML and the tools which help them succeed. Any tool which processes HTML needs to understand these whitespace semantics. So let's look at 3. Automated formatting, content management systems, and minification. I did not think about minification, and I am suddenly very scared. Automated formatting. For as long as we've had code, we've had arguments about the best way to write it. Everyone's got an opinion, and all of them except mine are wrong. How did he know? How do you know that my opinions are always right? Good author. So we use tools which automatically format everyone's code into a single, consistent, agreed-upon format. Sounds great. It doesn't just sound great, it is. I will die on that hill. Prettier is one of the tools that has had the most meaningful impact on the way that we develop since, C. The amount of impact Prettier has had in how most devs actually write code and think about things. The fact that formatting of code isn't a debate constantly anymore is a huge win. And it doesn't just sound great, it is. But there are certainly going to be problems here, and I'm scared. The problem with this is that formatting regularly changes whitespace. A long element can be broken up into multiple lines. Like here, it breaks it like that. I had this problem when I was writing the quick demo I just did with this HTML file. When I save, it reformats. And I had to fight that reformatting the entire time by using a different save command so it wouldn't change what I had done. Anything affecting indenting can also cause line breaks. For example, consider adding a wrapper div. Also, because the CSS determines inline behavior or block behavior, if the HTML file being formatted doesn't have a formatter smart enough to know what's happening from the CSS, that can break really bad, actually. Oh, God. Oh, God. So before we had this HTML, after we added this wrapper, which pushes this over the line length, which then causes it to be wrapped, And obviously, this shouldn't cause a change in what the user sees, but it can. These formatting changes are intended to be no-ops. They make my life easier as a dev, but they should never change significant whitespace for the user, except that they do change significant whitespace because they introduce leading and trailing spaces. Consider this example. I know this example. I've done this before. It sucks. We have this. Check out my space website, space, and read my blog. And this renders correct with the website part having the space separate and not included in the tag. And it's going to include the space at the end here in the link. I have seen and read so many blogs where this happens. I know called it. I did know this one. I didn't know why this happened before, but now I do. I hate this language. Yeah, that's horrible. That this becoming a new line doesn't do anything wrong in the front, only for that new line. Why? Prettier has an option for this called HTML whitespace sensitivity. Setting this to ignore will allow the above change, so the formatted code looks great, but it might break your UI. Strict will avoid introducing a significant whitespace change for your UI, but it leaves a truly pretty HTML. I did not think Prettier could spit that code out. What? I've never seen code formatted like. Apparently other people in chat have, but I've never seen code like that before. This looks like what I would expect from Shittier, which I have a video on. It's like Prettier, but awful. Takes your well-formatted code, and it does that to it. That is what this looks like to me. In strict mode, Prettier can't introduce a new line between the A tag and the word web because that could change the rendered output. Instead, it has to put the new line inside the A start tag since it's the only location it can add an insignificant whitespace. Same for the closing tag and the following and. Prettier also has an HTML whitespace sensitivity CSS option, which tells it to respect the default values of the CSS display property. Hopefully, after reading this post, you should know what that means. Given a div tag, it can format with the ignore behavior because leading and trailing whitespaces aren't significant in block render contexts. Span tags will use the strict behavior because the leading and trailing whitespace is significant. That makes a lot of sense as a middle ground between ignore and strict. But after reading this post, you should also know that it's not entirely accurate, and it breaks if you do something like div display inline. Prettier doesn't know anything about your CSS, so it can only infer the default display for a given tag. It can't know the actual display value used at runtime. I predicted this one. Look at me. I'm learning through the article. Who would have thought? No shame on Prettier here, by the way. I can't blame the tool for formatting HTML like this. The CSS mode is actually a very useful middle ground for getting the nicer ignore formatting in at least most of the cases where it won't have any negative effects while still using strict, where it's likely to be important. Again, the real problem here is that HTML whitespace is ambiguous and can't tell that Prettier wants to ignore whitespace for the developer's benefit without affecting the rendered output. Yeah, you can't know in the HTML what the whitespace behavior is, which is insane to me. The fact that you can't know the actual whitespace behavior without knowing the CSS display and whitespace properties is just the cherry on top that cements the HTML formatting as a fundamentally unsolvable problem. And that's just the first of these three places. Content management systems. Many hands are involved in developing and shipping a web page from scratch to its end users. Web devs, designers, product managers, and so much more participate in various parts of the process. As a result, the idea of a single individual writing an entire web page from scratch in an HTML file is relatively rare in the year 2024. Sorry, Alex Russell. Real talk, though. This is a very real and important point. Most web pages have content from lots of people, many of which aren't devs and don't know all this bullshit. A very common scenario is for a web dev to focus on the HTML parts of the page while the marketing, product, and localization teams are focused on the raw text content inside a separate content management system, a CMS. An e-commerce site selling shoes probably doesn't want to file a bug with the devs every time they need to update the marketing copy for how the shoes will make you a faster runner in a not at all legally binding manner. And as a result, the modern HTML code looks less like span, fast shoes, close tag, and more like this. It's actually funny, I brought up the translations thing because this is actually what ends up happening. CMS.getString, shoes.description. Yep, you get the idea. This sounds straightforward, but it pulls on a whole host of whitespace issues. The content's displayed in HTML context, meaning HTML's whitespace rules still apply. However, the author of the text likely doesn't know that. Yeah, the fact that whoever fills out the formatting request or the internationalization request or whatever is generating the string that gets put here. There's no way they know about all these quirks because I didn't know about all these quirks. Whew. For example, if the text starts or ends with a whitespace, the whitespace will naturally be placed into the span, and that will affect spacing with adjacent elements. Another possibility is if the marketing team is led by one of those people who insists on all sentences ending with two spaces after a period. Those two spaces will be collapsed into a single space and lead to a very upset marketing team, which directly leads to a mildly annoyed development team. Yep. I don't want to tangent on this too hard. I hate the two spaces after a sentence, people. They're worse than the people who hate Oxford commas. I like Oxford commas, not as much as I like trailing commas. Don't you do a comma tier list? Penciling that one down for later. Anyways, those use cases are possible, but not exactly common, and likely something that most devs can just ignore. However, you have to imagine the marketing team is looking at a text field like this, where you have the shoes will make you new line, the fastest runner around, 2 new lines, star, not legally binding. Marketing is interpreting the content as plain text, but that's not how HTML works, linking to the document thing at the bottom. As a result, they end up looking at completely borked disclaimers. I've seen something like this on so many sites. You'd think the CMS should be able to solve around this problem, but it can't. There are 2 new lines between the word around here and the star, but there's no trivial replacement which will prevent them from being collapsed into a single space. The only viable option here is to render all text as pre, which is a very heavy-handed solution, and it forces whole white space to be retained when likely only some of it actually mattered. For example, the new lines between you and the are likely just the author avoiding a horizontal scroll bar in the text area, not a hard line break, which end users should see. Realistically, both the CMS and the individual writing the copy need some understanding of HTML whitespacing collapse rules in order to know what will be applied and what you will see here. One other negative effect is that it becomes difficult to reuse text content between multiple front ends. For example, if the same shoes are displayed in a native Android or iOS app, which doesn't have the same whitespace collapsing behavior, they will render the same text differently. This makes it very difficult to ensure the same text is actually rendered consistently and implicitly couples any text rendered to HTML itself to the whitespace collapsing rules of that environment, even though the raw text itself should be independently usable in any front end. Yep. I've ran into this too with, again, Android and iOS and translations. Ugh. I will also say React Native they put a lot of work into solving handfuls of these problems. So I guess this is a point to React Native and a lot of points against HTML. And everyone's favorite, minification. The same problem exists for HTML minifiers, tools which remove unnecessary content from web pages to reduce file size. Multiple spaces are equivalent to single spaces, so they can be pretty easily reduced, like this. Can be turned to that. But they also need to retain the leading and trailing spaces for the same reasons as mentioned above. HTML minifiers can't know for certain what elements will render in what kind of contexts and exactly what the whitespace behavior will be. Therefore, they need to retain a bunch of spaces which likely don't matter just to make sure they retain the one space which does matter and accept a larger output file size, penalizing all users of the page. I don't want to think about what percentage of HTML being sent down the wire is unused whitespace because it'll make me sad. So I'm going to not think about that. So how can we fix this? Since all of this is so complicated and involved, it'd be great to fix HTML so all the whitespace problems go away. Is that even possible? What would it look like? I don't have a perfect solution in mind, but I do have some thoughts. As I mentioned earlier, the root of the problem is that whitespace in HTML is ambiguous. Does the space exist to support the dev, or does it exist to be readable to the end user? That question is unanswerable and is the core problem that we should fix here. The best way to do this is to change the HTML syntax such that significant whitespace is syntactically distinct from insignificant whitespace. The obvious approach is to just do it like every other programming language. Quote your strings. I'm not fully opposed to this. Let's see where things end up. I see your disgusted reaction, and honestly, I kind of get it. I'm not disgusted. Might be because my background is normal programming languages and not HTML, but to each their own. I don't think this looks very good either, and I wouldn't exactly want to write it. It's not particularly elegant, and I hate the leading spaces necessary on all but the first line. So inconsistent. In this proposed syntax, we at least have implicit concatenation like Python, so you don't need the plus signs everywhere. The idea is that all spaces inside the quotes are significant and retained for the user, while all spaces outside the quotes are insignificant and used solely for the dev. Whitespace characters like tabs are allowed and preserved when used within quotes. New lines are banned by default, is it would be way too easy to forget a closing quote and introduce unintended significant spacing. Therefore, a quoted new line is a syntax error. Interesting. An LF HTML entity would allow for new lines to be directly specified, or you could use a triple quote syntax to define a multi-line string. But what about these tabs? What happens to those? Dedent stays winning. Lots of languages have triple quote syntax like this, and my suggestion is to follow C#'s example by making them indentation aware. The opening and closing triple quote tokens need to be the last and first tokens of their respective lines, and the text content between them must be indented to match. That makes a lot of sense. Since this is indented this far, the text under has to be indented the same amount. And if it indents more, then it includes that. And if it indents less, error. That's cool. Look at C# continuing to do things right and forcing all of us to accept that our languages suck. If you don't already know, C# was created by the same person as TypeScript, which I find really fun. This formats nicely while still allowing precise white space to be added where it's needed. Aside from adding quotes, there's a couple other changes which need to be made. Any text outside of a quoted string is a syntax error. Yep, that I'm fine with. I mentioned before, Lit rules already can do this, and I think it makes sense. How it renders that text is up to the browser. I really don't care what the fallback behavior is, given that browsers tend to not throw errors on bad HTML. You can put some terrible HTML in the browser, and it will do what it's supposed to do. Well, I guess not, because it's doing things that shouldn't. Anyways. The main point is that any tool is free to treat unquoted text as a syntax error, along the same lines of putting a span inside of the div tag like that. Whitespace needs to be removed or reworked to always use the standard whitespace behavior. It can still control line wrapping and other presentational aspects. It's just the raw text content which should be consistent across all options. This reduces the dependency on CSS to understand how HTML text is parsed. In point 3, pre-tags should be removed. I'm okay with just doing this anyways at this point. All text is pre-formatted because it's inside of quotes, so having a special tag is no longer needed. Formatting arbitrary user inputs into a quoted string is not meaningfully harder than HTML escaping the string already is today, so there's no value in keeping the pre-tags around. And also, you keep this as a backwards compatible feature, which is an exception to the no unquoted strings rule, but a purist implementation of the proposal would remove it entirely. Yeah, I say kill it. That's where I vote for sure. Would this solve the problem? Since whitespace is no longer ambiguous, we don't need whitespace collapsing anymore. Whitespace outside the quotes is removed altogether, while whitespace inside of them is preserved. No collapsing needed. Developers can add multiple spaces without needing the NBSP. Finally, we can just put space in things and it works. Prettier and other formatters can adjust the developer side of the whitespace as much as they want, and even join and split string literals to move them across multiple lines without changing the rendered output. Dope. CMSs can be greatly simplified as well, since there's no whitespace behavior for them to understand or preserve. Whatever text marketing gives just gets wrapped in quotes and either replaces the /n with an LF or it uses triple quotes. This way, it outputs the way marketing intended. Dope. Minifiers can also drop all whitespace outside of quotes and be fine. Can even merge the quotes together. Look at that. Sadly, this doesn't solve the narrator issue that we described earlier. Two strings still need to be treated distinctly in a block formatting context, while strings would be implicitly joined in an inline formatting context. So this problem, if you do this for some reason, actually, I shouldn't say if you do this for some reason, because we do this with things like the upload thing logo. It's pretty common. Yeah. You still need inline elements to join together, so it's possible to style and control parts of words. For example, adding emphasis only to part of a word. Not fun. I don't see a good solution to this without completely reworking HTML's rendering model such that every tag has a statically knowable formatting context, which is a much more complicated change to make. So what is the DX impact? I get a lot of devs would probably push back on adding quotes to everything because of the negative DX impact. To preempt some of those arguments, I'll remind you of a few points I've hopefully made clear. 1. Today's confusing whitespace rules are their own DX problems. 2. HTML tooling becomes more stable. 3. HTML already breaks the rules of common text formatting. And 4, every other language already works this way. Don't we want HTML to be a programming language? Shouldn't it work like one? An alternative approach could use whitespace control characters like Nunjuck's implementation to achieve a different solution to the problem. However, I think it actually leads to overall worse DX. Interesting. This part's detailed, but I'll TLDR it. We can't just ship because all of HTML needs to be backwards compatible, and this would break a ton of things. It would be very complicated to add this in like this. So what can we do instead? A non-collapsible. This is what I thought it was immediately. This would make a ton of sense. An NCSP, even what I was thinking there. This author did a phenomenal job of showing us how he's thinking so we can come to the same conclusions he does along with him. This is phenomenal. The one fix I can think of is to find a drop-in replacement for NBSP. If developers want a non-collapsible space which doesn't come with the baggage of non-breaking and forced width behaviors, then we can come up with a new entity which meets those needs. My suggestion, add a new named HTML entity and CSP for non-collapsible space. It's a regular space which does not get collapsed. This would take on the non-collapsible benefits of NBSP, while dropping the non-breaking and forced width behaviors which lead to line wrapping issues. When you just want to add a space, NCSP is likely closer to what you actually want and look better with the line wrapped too. Given the layering of HTML parser and CSS today, I suspect this would actually require an entirely new Unicode character representing a non-collapsible space, distinct from the existing space character. Except Unicode is used in more than just HTML, so now everything has to support it. Great. The fact that we might have to make changes to Unicode because HTML sucks is really funny. Apparently, the author filed an issue with the CSS working group to discuss adding this directly. I'm going to go hit the upvote button on this. I'm the third person to like this issue. I am going to post this link. It will be in the description. Do not be annoying. Do not spam it with comments. Do not make us look bad. Just go hit the thumbs up if you think this is a good idea, and don't touch anything else if you can. I don't want to cause them problems. I just want them to know that we support this idea if we support this idea. That's it. Notice how quickly this is changing that I mentioned. I was like number 3. I'm proud. Practical advice. Given that we can't fix HTML, what can we do? Understanding the actual behavior of HTML goes a long way, but as you probably figured it out, it's surprisingly complicated, and I don't think it really scales to expect everyone who writes HTML to fully understand it, nor would I expect a typical code reviewer to spot whitespace bugs looking only at the HTML code. Fortunately, HTML whitespace does usually work, and we can often rely on that. It's mainly about minimizing edge case behavior where you need to look up a blog post like this. Rather than preventing unexpected collapsing behavior, we can mitigate the issue to be less of a problem in practice. To that end, I have a few suggestions, all of which use the term avoid rather than never, since they are focused more on mitigation rather than prevention. Avoid leading and trailing whitespace in links. Good call. Do your best to not have whitespaces in new lines with link tags. In my experience, links are by far the biggest challenge with whitespace, given that they are underlined by default and it's a common style. While spacing might be incorrect in many situations, the underline is usually where it becomes a noticeable problem that needs to be fixed. Totally agree. Avoid changing layout behavior with display. So don't set display block on things that shouldn't be blocks, like asides or spans. And if you can, use an additional tag to say what you want it to be. So if you want an aside to work inline instead of block, put a span in there so it does. Span roles assign, that scares me. And I like that the author called out there might be accessibility implications. So don't do that unless you're confident in it. Apparently, the same guidance should apply to usage of flexbox and grid, both of which force the children to be block elements in a way that formatters would be unable to detect. Therefore, flex and grid elements should always contain child tags, which are block formatted by default, like using div instead of span, in order to align with the formatter's expectations. Is this a pro Tailwind post now that I think about it? Doesn't Tailwind give us much more of this information? I'm going to overthink that. Back to this. Avoid changing collapsing behavior with whitespace. Yeah. Avoid using the whitespace CSS tag to the best of your ability because it makes things much weirder in your HTML. Also, avoid insignificant whitespace in pre-tags. So if you are using a pre-tag, deal with the fact that you can't use tabs anymore. It sucks, but you have to. Yeah, I don't like the look either, but the approach avoids the confusing leading and trailing new line behaviors and it prevents indentation accidentally leaking into the content. None of these suggestions really help HTML tooling maintainers, unfortunately, since they still need to deal with whitespace regardless. But I warned you at the start, this post is partially for sharing knowledge and partially for venting about how awful the whitespace in HTML actually is. Well, I hope me reading this has been some amount of relief and you feel like you were able to vent. Commisery is important, and I'm very much commiserating. This GIF, okay, fine, but I'm going to complain the whole time. Yep. The appendix includes this very fun section. Isn't HTML just a document? And as tempted as I am to read it, you should go read the article so you can have it yourself, and the author deserves it. So go check it out. Once again, huge shout to Doug Parker for writing this one, and a link to the post and the thank you has been made. That was great. Go give Doug a follow. Let me know what you think. And until next time, keep your white spaces safe.